Court is back in session. Jury, please. All rise for the jury. Everybody be seated, please. You may call your first rebuttal witness, Mr. Fuchs or Ms. Dugan.
State calls Major Annie Johnson.
Okay.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. Good morning, Major Johnson. Will you introduce yourself to our jury and spell your name for our court reporter, please?
Sure. My name's Anne Marie Johnson, and that's spelled ANNE-MARIE. Last name spelled JOHNSON.
Okay. Did you go by Annie?
I do.
Okay. And what is your, I called you a major. Where do you work?
I work at the Tallahassee Police Department. I'm currently major over the Patrol Bureau, Northern Sector.
And how long have you been with Tallahassee Police Department?
I've been with Tallahassee Police Department for 18 years and in law enforcement for a total of 20.
Okay. Were you with Tallahassee Police Department back in November of 2010?
I was.
And what was your assignment at that time?
I was an investigator with the Homicide Violent Crimes Unit.
Okay. And I guess throughout your 20 years, have you kind of been in pretty much every different unit at TPD at some point?
Pretty much through everyone within the Investigations Bureau, yes.
Okay. All right. So in November of 2010, you said you were an investigator in the Homicide Violent Crimes Unit. What was your role in this case?
I assisted Investigator Mark Lewis. I was one of the assisting investigators.
Okay. Were you the only woman with the last name of Johnson who was an investigator on this case?
Yes.
Okay. Was there a woman named Joanna Johnson who was ever working on this case?
No.
All right. So if there was a woman whose last name was Johnson on the case, it would be you.
That's correct.
All right. And your last name was Johnson back in 2010 as well?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. So I guess we would be a little familiar with you already because we saw you in the November 30th interview with the defendant, right? His second interview?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. You were the one saying, I know you have a cell phone. That was you?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, when the defendant was arrested in Minnesota in 2011, so fast forward about a year from that interview, did you ever call him on the phone when he was in Minnesota?
No, ma'am.
Either before or after he was arrested? Oh, no, I'm sorry. Did you call him in Minnesota before or after he was arrested?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did he ever tell you at any time, I'm talking before arrest, during the investigation, after arrest, did he ever tell you at any time that he went to Brandy Peters' house on November 19th for any time or at any time or for any reason?
No, he did not.
So he never told you that he was at Brandy Peters' house that day?
No.
That's all I have.
Well,
you say Mr. Segura never told you that that he was at Brandy Peters' house on November 19th, correct?
That's correct.
You wouldn't have any idea what other investigators or officers he talked to, correct?
To my recollection, there was only a handful of us that he spoke to that worked together on the case.
I'm sorry?
That worked together on the case. There was only a few of us that he would have spoken to.
All of the homicide investigators in that division at TPD were assisting on this case, correct?
Correct.
And so that would have included the case agent, Mark Lewis, correct?
That's correct.
And then also Mr. Basio, now Lieutenant Basio,
That's correct.
and yourself.
Yes.
What other investigators were involved, homicide investigators?
Investigator Doubrava at the time, it's Lieutenant Wilder now. Investigator Mark Lewis. Now Lieutenant Mike Selesky, who was a sergeant over our unit at the time. And then there were several other investigators that were assigned various tasks throughout the investigation. Running down legal process, getting those signed, doing some other interviews of other individuals, family members, that sort of thing.
Sergeant Corbett, too, in technical ops?
Yes, I'm sorry, I
Okay.
forgot him.
So a lot of people involved.
Yes.
especially relative to any other case. It's not normal for every single homicide investigator plus tech ops to all be involved in the same case, right?
Not necessarily, but yes, it was a different case.
Right. And in terms of how each investigator involved was communicating with each other, do you agree that it would be fair to say the left hand wasn't always talking to the right in this case?
Yes, there were a lot of moving parts and a lot of things going on at the same time. That's correct.
Okay. So different people were focused on different scenes and different evidence, correct?
Yes.
Okay. One of the things that you were involved in was obtaining a warrant for a bug, I guess is the best way I can phrase it, that was ultimately placed in or on Mr. Segura's vehicle, right?
Yes.
And that would have been in the year that you guys were investigating before you arrested him, correct?
Yes.
And so there was an extended period of time, was it 10 months, something like that, where you had an operational listening device in his vehicle and never got a single piece of incriminating evidence from that entire time, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. No further questions.
Redirect.
Yes, sir. That would just mean that he never, from what you heard in his car, he never admitted to anyone in his car that he committed these crimes.
That's correct.
Okay. Speaking of the bug, did you make a call to Mr. Segura one time before he ever went to Minnesota while he was here in Tallahassee on his phone while there was a wire in his car?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Tell us about that phone call.
Well, earlier in the investigation, we had let Mr. Segura know that once we received the DNA results with regards to paternity for Javante, that we would let him know what the results were. So I made that call with that purpose, and to let him know that we had gotten the results back from the DNA, and to see if I could elicit a response to what that meant to him, knowing about Javante actually being his biological son.
So you wanted to inform him that he was actually his son and then say something to see how he would react to you.
Correct.
Okay. So did you tell him on that phone call that you got the DNA results back and Javante was his son?
I did.
And how did he react to you?
If I remember correctly, he just stayed quiet with regards to that portion of it.
Okay. And then what did you say?
I said, so how does it feel to know that you killed your biological son?
And what did he say?
He said something to the effect of, what evidence do you have to prove that?
And then did he hang up on you at that point?
Yes.
Fair to say, if he had ever told anyone, any of the investigators, that he was actually at this victim's house the day that the murders happened, that's something that you would know.
Yes.
Okay. That would have been a big deal on the investigation to you all, right?
Yes.
For the person that you're suspecting who committed this crime to now admit that he was at her house that day.
Correct.
That would have been a change, a huge change from what he said in his November 20th and November 30th interviews, right?
Correct.
You would have seen a report about that.
Yes.
Excuse me. You would have seen a report about that.
Yes.
You guys would have discussed that.
Correct.
Even though there were a couple of investigators working on this case, y'all were regularly discussing this case all the time together.
Yes.
Okay. And have you ever heard of him ever admitting to anyone that he was at Brandy Peters' house the day of these murders at any time for any reason?
No.
That's all.
Any juror have a question of this witness? All right, if not, you may step down. Call your next witness.
So he calls April Doubrava.
You remain under oath. You were previously sworn witness.
Yes. Yes.
Right. I think you previously testified, but just state your name again for the record, please.
My name is Lieutenant Doubrava-Wilder.
Lieutenant, I think you previously told us that on November 20th, the day these bodies were discovered, your role there at 908 Saddle Creek Run was kind of overseeing the crime scene.
That's correct.
Okay. Did your team go through the trash cans in Brandy Peters' home that day?
On that day, we looked at the top, we didn't, it was more for preservation. So we did more of dealing with the bodies and collecting and going through the crime scene. So we looked at the tops. We didn't dump them out that day. Teams that went back other days then did a thorough cleaning of the entire house.
Okay, so that day you looked at the top of the trash cans to see if anything of obvious evidentiary value was in the trash cans.
That's correct.
On that day, did y'all see a condom or a condom wrapper on top of any of those trash cans?
No, we did not.
Okay. In the following days, when I guess an even more intensive processing was done and you guys dumped the trash cans, was a condom or a condom wrapper found in those trash cans?
I was never notified that a condom wrapper was found in the trash cans. On the second and subsequent days that went out there, there was another team that went out there, but I was still in charge of all the evidence that was collected as far as sending it to FDLE, so anything of value that was discovered was identified to me, and then I would determine whether it needed to go to for processing or not.
And if a condom or a condom wrapper was found in those trash cans, could that be considered maybe important to the case?
Right, it would indicate somebody else being there at the scene.
So in other words, Brandy Peters might have had sex the day that this happened. Y'all could send it to FDLE to be tested for DNA, maybe get some more information about what happened that day, who was over there.
Correct.
So that would have been something that you or any member of your team would have informed you of as the sergeant overseeing everything.
Right, I was an investigator overseeing that, but yes.
I apologize, as the
No worries.
investigator overseeing it. And were you ever notified that either a condom or a condom wrapper was found the day of November 20th or any day after?
No.
Did your team walk around the entire property of Miss Peters' home and yard?
Yes. We
Okay.
did that day and additional days.
Okay. Was her backyard dug up? Were there any holes in it?
No.
Okay. You weren't involved in you weren't in the room for any of the interviews of Mr. Segura, right?
Correct.
Okay. And you might not have even ever talked to him, I don't know, but did he ever tell you, though, that he was at Miss Peters' house the day of these murders on November 19th?
No, I never spoke to him.
Okay, that's all.
Ron?
This may seem a silly question, but y'all didn't send like a snake camera down the plumbing or have the septic tank pumped for evidence, correct?
Correct.
And so if a condom or condom wrapper were flushed, that's not evidence that would be available to you, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. No further questions.
Raise your hand.
No, sir.
Any juror have a question of this witness? All right, if not, you can step down. We need to keep her any further.
No, sir.
All right.
Oh, actually, she'll remain under the rule, but she
All right,
can
remain under the rule.
go out about her business.
Call your next witness.
State calls Monica Peters.
You were previously sworn?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Peters, have a seat. You remain under oath. State your name for the record, please.
Monica Peters,
All right, you may proceed.
Ms. Peters, what was Brandy Peters' date of birth?
February the 14th, 1983.
February 14th, 83?
1983.
Okay. So if she was born in 83, then she would have turned 17 years old, right? In February of 2000?
Yes.
So in the year 2000, she would have been 17 years old.
Yes.
Did she have a driver's license when she was 17 years old?
No, ma'am. She got
When
her-
did
She
when
got her
did she-
driver's license when she was 20 years old.
Okay. So she would not have gotten a driver's license until then the year 2003 when she was 20 years old.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. When did she get her first car that she was able to drive?
Right in 2006.
Okay. So she would have been 23 then in 2006?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So 17 in the year 2000, didn't get a driver's license till she was 20, 3 years later, didn't have a car that she had access to drive until 2006, 3 years after that.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, when she was 23. All right, you told us in your last testimony last week that you know, you guys were obviously sisters, and y'all were sisters who talked and saw each other on a daily basis, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Did Brandy ever deal or transport drugs?
No, ma'am.
Did she ever disappear for days at a time for out-of-town trips?
No, ma'am.
Had she ever been to Texas?
No, ma'am.
Had she ever even been, I mean, was she somebody who had been very many places at all outside of Tallahassee and North Florida?
No, ma'am.
So she was not somebody who was going out of town often.
No, and definitely not at 16, 17. She was living in my mom's house. My mom was very strict. She was not one of those people that she never let us out her eyesight, and that's facts.
Okay.
Everybody that knows my mom knows that she was very, very strict on us. And at 16, 17, she wouldn't have not left the house for days at a time.
All right, so for Brandy's whole life, you never knew her to go out of town for days at a time, but especially in the year 2000, when she's 17 years old, she's at your mom's house. She's not going out of town anywhere, even for one day.
No, ma'am.
All right. Did Brandy have any money?
No, ma'am.
Did she have some flashy lifestyle?
No, she didn't.
Did she receive food stamps from the government?
Yes, she did.
You told us last time you testified that her car that was in the driveway was a car that was actually broken down that week, and it was an older car that she'd borrowed from your mother.
Yes,
Did
ma'am.
Brandy, her whole life, from the time she was first got a car, I guess in 2006, you said, to the time that she died in 2010, did she ever have a car that was reliable enough to make it to Texas?
No, ma'am.
Before she qualified for her house on Saddle Creek Run, which you told us was Section 8 housing, before that, where did she live before that?
She lived in Holton Street Projects. At
Okay.
the top of Holton Street Projects, right
And
off
is-
of Holton Street.
And you
And
said
that
it's
was
a
a
housing
hub
project?
It was hub housing.
Okay, so it was a HUD housing project
Yes,
on Holton
ma'am.
Street? All right, I'm sorry for talking over you.
Oh, no, you're fine.
And was that an apartment?
Yes, it was an apartment.
Before her Holton Street apartment and the housing project, before that, was she kind of just staying family member to family member?
Before that, she lived with me. Well, she lived with my mama for a little while. And before she lived with my mama, she lived with me on Laura Lee Road in Appalachia Ridge. And before then, she lived with me in Appalachia Ridge on, I think that was Cobra Street. Me and my kid's daddy, both of those houses, she lived with us.
Okay. On November 20th, the day that the bodies were discovered, what did police tell you and the rest of your family there at the scene about what they found inside the house?
Well, when they first got there, they didn't tell us anything. They just made everybody get back. So they told us that to get back. The first lady, she just told me to get the kids out of the car or whatever. Because I remember.
This is your kids. These are your
told
kids.
me to get my kids out of the car because the black car that was parked in that yard, that was my car that was parked in the front of the yard because I was the first one to get there besides my brother pulled up. So the police, I don't think I remember that day where she told me to remove the kids from the car, to stand back just in case anybody was in the house. And so we all got back, and then another officer arrived on the scene. And after that officer arrived, I remember them walking around the house or whatever, and clearing around the outside of the house out. And then when they came back, another officer came, and I remember the officer taking her stick, breaking the window out.
Okay, let me ask you a more specific question, okay? Did officers tell you at some point that Brandy, and I guess at first, 2 children were found in the home?
Yes, but that wasn't right away.
Okay.
They had brought out to the crime scene van, and me and my mom, that they was all standing down there. My mom was on the inside of it. I remember one of the officers coming down there and saying that, asking us who all we thought that was in the house. And we told her that my sister Brandy, her 2 twin girls, Tamaya, Tanaya, and Javante, and they told us that they only seen my sister and the 2 twin girls. They did not tell us where they was located at. And my mama said, well, my grandson should have been in that house. And he said, well, unfortunately, we haven't seen a child in the house.
Did they eventually later tell you that they did find a 3rd child in the house?
I think that was way later, after the crime scene had then came and they was going through the house or whatever, and realized that he was on the bottom, up
Right.
on the bottom of the girls or whatever. I don't know, but it wasn't.
But you know that since this has happened, I'm talking about that day.
Oh, that day, yeah.
Right.
That day. No.
My question for you is, that day on November 20th, did y'all have any knowledge from police about where these children were found in the home?
No, ma'am.
Did they tell you how they died?
No, ma'am.
Did you know anything besides the fact that the children and Brandy were deceased and they were inside that home?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So now, from being in trial, watching the evidence, you know that they couldn't find Javante because he was on the bottom.
Yes, ma'am.
But that day, you had no knowledge of where they were found.
No, ma'am. They did not tell us that. They just told us that they were sorry to inform us that everybody that was in the house was deceased.
Okay. That's all.
Right. Wait.
Ma'am, you said to your knowledge Brandy wasn't involved in drug dealing, correct?
Of course, yes.
And your testimony is that wasn't part of her lifestyle,
No, it wasn't.
and she didn't associate with folks who lived that lifestyle, at least not closely, correct?
I can't tell you that she didn't. I wouldn't sit on stand and tell you that she didn't associate with people that just because you associate yourself with somebody or know somebody that does it, that doesn't mean you do it.
She was closely associated with Kenny Green, right?
But she knew Kenny Green. She wasn't associated with him. They wasn't together at the time that all of this occurred, and I know that for facts.
He was her boyfriend for
No,
a
he
while
wasn't.
there, and everybody believed that Javante was his son for some period of time. Isn't that true?
I don't know about that.
Okay. Kenny Green was actually in custody at the same time at the same place that Carlos Sanchez was, over at Federal Detention
He
Center. right?
was.
So your testimony to Ms. Dugan was that law enforcement didn't tell you all that they only initially found 2 kids in the bathtub. Is that right?
They didn't tell us they found him in the bathtub.
Okay. And perhaps you can answer this. How would anybody know that law enforcement hadn't been able to initially find the third child victim unless that information was widely disseminated? How would anybody know that on the 20th if that information wasn't widely disseminated by law enforcement?
Well, I don't. Then maybe that was after they found out, because when we was on the scene, and I know that for facts. When we was there as a family, everybody showed up. They did not tell us that kids was found in no bathtub.
Okay. Your previous testimony that everything was a blur that day, correct?
No, I told you I could have been emotionally. I didn't tell you everything was a blur. I said I could have been emotionally. I said it could have been my emotions going everywhere when I wrote that report. I didn't say everything was a blur.
Okay.
Because I remember that scene today, 9 years ago, like it was today.
So
Nothing
weren't
changed.
you weren't so emotionally distraught that you would have been saying things that were untrue.
I'm not gonna say nothing that's not untrue. I'm gonna sit here and I'm gonna tell the truth.
Okay. And that's why you told investigator Jernigan on the day that the bodies were found.
I would object to improper
It's the
impeachment.
Back to the earlier question, I don't think you answered this question. If law enforcement hadn't disseminated the information
This was asked and answered.
Don't answer the question till I hear the question, Mr. Peters. Ask your question.
Yes, sir. Let me back up and ask the predicate first. Law enforcement was on scene for quite a while on the 20th, correct? The day that the bodies were found?
Yes.
And were canvassing the neighborhood, talking to people, right?
Yes, they was.
Okay. So you're not aware of what every officer on scene was doing and what they were telling everybody, correct?
No, I wasn't.
Okay. And you only know about what they told you, is that right?
I only know what they came and told me and my family.
Okay. So do you agree that it would be impossible for anybody to know that law enforcement couldn't initially find the third child victim unless law enforcement had spread that information around?
I would object to speculation.
I think it assumes facts, not evidence. She hasn't said that they didn't tell her they were missing one child. She said she heard that.
Let me clarify that then. Did law enforcement tell you that they were unable to find the third child victim?
Yes, they did tell us that.
Okay. And later on that same day, you found out that they found the third child victim, Javante, underneath his sisters, correct?
Well, yeah, they told us that the third child was in the house after they cleared the crime, after they went in and cleared the crime scene, but that was later that day. That wasn't like when we was out there, because after the crime scene got there and they told us that they was gonna clear the house out and bring out all the bodies, they asked us to leave. So me and my mama left. If I could recall, my brother stayed there. To Maya and Tanaya daddy, Tony, he stayed there. He wouldn't leave. So it was a few family members that stayed there. But I know that that day, me, my mama, and my stepdaddy, all of us left because they asked us, they wanted us to leave just so they can remove the bodies from the house.
So that's a yes. On the 20th, at some point, law enforcement told you that the third child victim, Javante, was discovered underneath
but we
his...
still did not know how they was how they was died, how it was where they were located at. They didn't tell us anything about where they was located at.
Your testimony was that they didn't tell you he was located under his sisters? Your testimony is
Well,
they
that
didn't tell
was
you
later on. That was later, but that wasn't at the time of the crime scene. They didn't disclose that information when we was there. We didn't talk to anybody. I know for a fact that none of my sisters and brothers and none of us went to nobody's house. We didn't talk to nobody that day but the law enforcement officer.
So your testimony is that law enforcement told you Javante was found and nobody asked where he was found?
No.
Okay.
For the whole while of this case, they asked us, did we want to know what happened to them or what was the cause of death, and we said no, and I know those are facts. Even
I
the law
understand.
enforcement can comply to that one.
No further questions.
Losing these little children in your family, y'all didn't even want to know how they died.
No, we didn't.
Even when law enforcement asked, you didn't even want to know.
No, ma'am.
And you're telling us later, after November 20th, they told you that the reason they couldn't find Javante was because he was underneath. But on November 20th, when y'all are on scene that day, all they told you was, we found Brandy and 2 children. They are deceased. Y'all said there should be a third child. And then later, after forensics and crime scene was gone, they said, we did find the third child. Everyone in the home is deceased.
Yes.
They never told you told us how they died or where they were found.
No, ma'am. They never told us.
Did Henry Segura ever come to the crime scene?
No.
That's all.
Hey, Jerry, I have a question of this one. All right, you step in. Call you next week.
So he calls Mark Lewis.
Yes, Your Honor.
Stand up to the rail, please.
Yes, Your Honor.
You remain under oath.
Yes, Your Honor.
Please state your name for the record.
Mark Lewis.
You may proceed.
When you interviewed the defendant, Henry Segura, on November 20th, did you tell him any details about how Brandy Peters died?
No.
What about the twin girls? Did you give him any details about how they died or where in the home they were found?
No.
At any point in that interview on November 20th, did the defendant ask you how the twins died?
He never did.
Did he ever ask you how Brandy Peters died?
He never did.
On November 20th, at the time that you interviewed the defendant, did you even know how these victims died?
No, I didn't.
Had their autopsies even been done yet on November 20th?
No, they weren't.
I guess they weren't even done till the following day, I believe, or the day after that?
That's correct.
Okay. Did law enforcement put out a press release about this case?
Yes.
And when was that done?
The following day, November 21st.
Okay, so November 21st would have been on Sunday, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the day after the bodies are discovered and the day after the first interview of the defendant.
That's correct.
All right. Did the press release give any details about how these victims were killed?
No.
Did it give any details about where in the house they were found?
No.
All right. Why did you not include that information?
as much as law enforcement tries to be transparent, we also need to disclose pertinent information, so when we do have interviews or when people have information, they can fill in those pieces for
Okay.
us.
So you try to keep some pieces of information close to the chest that maybe only the murderer would know.
That's correct.
All right. And to not divulge details of an investigation like that, is that a policy for all of your department?
Yes.
To not give out any specific details of an investigation?
We do not give out specific details of open investigations.
Okay, thank you.
Rob? Yes,
You know who Pint is, right?
Sir,
You know who Pint is, correct?
I know her name, I don't know her.
Margarita Davis, right?
I believe Johnson, but
Johnson at the time, okay. Point is, you guys identified who that was.
yes,
As part of investigating and reconstructing Mr. Segura's day, you figured out who he would have seen and who he would have talked to that day, correct?
correct.
And she was one of the people y'all talked to at some point in the days and weeks following the murders, correct?
Yes,
Okay. And you said you didn't know the cause of death until after the autopsies were
That's
performed?
correct.
Right. But isn't it also true that Mr. Segura didn't know that? I mean, during your interview, didn't he tell you that he assumed all 3 kids were drowned because they were found in the bathtub?
no, he never told me that.
You don't recall that?
No, I don't.
Okay, no further questions.
redirect.
You've watched and read the transcript of that November 20th interview several times, have you not, Investigator Lewis?
Yes,
Safe to say this is maybe the most important case to you you've had in your career because of these 3 deceased children,
it is the most important case in my career.
okay? If he had ever told you in that November 20th interview that I've got the transcript for right here and that you've read several times that these children were drowned, found in the tub, anything like that, that would be reflected in there, that would be on the video that you watched, that would be in your memory, right?
Of course,
And he never asked how they died, and you never told him how they died, right?
that's correct.
He never asked where they were found, you never told them where they were found, right?
That's correct.
And what he said that, what he told you that he knew coming into that interview was that his hairdresser, Pint, told him that
Overruled.
Brandy and the 2 girls, the twins, were found dead in the home, and that Javante was missing. And then when he arrived at Pint's house, that Pint then told him, I heard that they found Javante too, and he's dead.
That is correct.
Okay. And that's what is reflected in the transcript and that we see, what we saw in that video when you were on the stand the other day.
Yes, ma'am.
That's all.
Any juror have a question of this witness? You step in.
Yes, Your Honor.
Oh, you just witness?
Can I ask him one more question, Judge?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Did Henry Segura,
Wait a minute, please.
I apologize, ever tell you that he was at Brandy's house on November 19th at any time for any reason?
He never told me that.
Okay. Okay. As the lead investigator in this case, if he had told that to any other officer, would there be a report about that?
Absolutely.
Would you have been informed about that?
I would have seen it.
Would that have been a pretty big deal since that was completely different than what he said in both his interviews?
That would have been huge.
All right, that's all.
Anybody? On that subject.
Yes, sir. So you're saying that you all were in close communication, you were aware of the details, the important details relative to the case, correct?
Y'all meaning who?
The homicide investigators.
We had cell phones, we could reach out to one another.
Right, and what you're saying to Ms. Dugan is that if something important, like Mr. Segura admitting to being at the scene on the day of the murders, if that had been conveyed to any of the investigators, that's something certainly that you would have known about as the lead investigator. You would have
Yes.
seen a report, heard about that.
Yes,
Isn't it true, Investigator Lewis, that as late as your deposition in 2016, you had no idea that DNA capable of being compared to known standards was found at the crime scene in this case?
can you rephrase that question, sir?
In 2016, 5 years after Mr. Segura had been arrested on this offense, at that late date, you still didn't know that interpretable DNA was discovered at the crime scene. Over 200 exhibits submitted to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement with mixtures and profiles, partial profiles. You didn't know that as late as 2016, isn't that true?
Yeah, I'm not a DNA guy, but I did not know that.
You don't think it's important that DNA is found at the scene that's capable of being compared to other people's profiles?
I reject argumentative.
I'm not familiar with the science of it. Oh, sorry, Judge. I'm not familiar with the science of it, sir, but I did not know that.
And while I understand you're not trained to interpret electrophorograms, you get a report from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement that tells you what their findings are, correct?
Correct.
So there was one on December 3rd from Joe Ellen Brown. You would have had that?
If
What
it's
year are you talking about?
I'm sorry, 2011.
2000,
Or 2010, I'm sorry, 2010, December 3rd, 2010. That would have been your first report from Joe Ellen Brown, correct?
That doesn't make sense. November 3rd, 2000?
December 3rd,
Okay.
I'm sorry, December 3rd, 2010.
I don't have these reports in front of me, sir. We're talking 9 years ago, but all FDLE reports have been submitted.
Okay, so you would have reviewed FDLE's reports?
Yes.
Okay, and how was it that you didn't know as late as 2016 that interpretable DNA was located all over the place?
Sir, I'm not familiar with the science.
Okay,
Tell you.
no further questions.
Redirect.
Yes, sir. In 2016, at that point, the defendant had been arrested for 5 years, right?
Yes.
And had not reached out to police at any point in that 5 years to try to speak to you or talk to you, give another interview, anything like that, right?
Correct.
I would
Okay.
object to questions about silence after arrest.
I'll sustain.
Request a curative instruction.
Okay. My point is,
Let
and,
me stop.
yes, sir. I apologize.
Slow down. Settle down, just look. All right. Sit down, please.
Okay.
All right. The objection is that it's not proper to hold against someone exercising their right to remain silent once they've been arrested. So that is an inappropriate question, and you should not consider that as evidence against the defendant. You may proceed, Ms. Dugan.
Thank you, I apologize. My point is that in 2016, at that point, the case had been with the state attorney's office for 5 years because he'd been arrested in 2011. At that point, it goes to the state attorney's office?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so it had been at the state attorney's office then for 5 years, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So at that point, you hadn't been involved in the case as far as anything involved with the defendant?
That's correct.
Okay. And so by 2016, any DNA evidence is going to be part of what the state attorney's office is doing at that point?
Yes.
Okay, that's all.
Any juror have a question? Right, you step down.
Yes,
Try next witness. You would face the clerk to be more question.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I swear.
Have a seat, right up around, please.
Morning, sir.
Good morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jurors?
And my name is Jason Newlin, Jasonnewlin.
And Mr. Newlin, where do you work?
I'm an investigator with the State Attorney's Office here in Tallahassee.
Are you a sworn law enforcement officer?
I am.
How long have you been with the state attorney's office?
I've been with the State Attorney's Office almost 10 years now, creeping up on 17 years law enforcement total.
Where are your prior law enforcement experience?
Fish and Wildlife and McCullough County Sheriff's Office.
During the course of those years, have you had an occasion to be involved in investigations at the state attorney's office or preparation for cases for trial in your duties?
Yes.
What are your duties at the state attorney's office?
That's a good question. It varies. It's generally case follow-up investigation, interviews, anything the prosecutors ask, we try to accomplish.
Okay. One of those duties, following up on contact made by certain persons to the state attorney's office or follow-up leads or whatever it is, homicide investigations or any other investigations for that matter as they become available after an arrest has been made.
Yes.
Okay. In the course of your duties, did you become involved as an investigator regarding state of Florida versus Henry Segura?
Yes, I did.
When did you become involved in that first time?
2010.
So you became involved in that even prior to the arrest?
Yes,
During the course of your involvement with the state of Florida versus Henry Segura, did you become familiar with a gentleman by the name of Santos?
I did.
At some point in this involvement, did Mr. Santos make a claim about Angel Avila being involved in the homicide?
It was around January of 2016 when he finally said that name.
Okay. So in January 2016, he first said the name Angel Avila.
Yes,
Had law enforcement, including yourself, had contact with Mr. Santos prior to that?
yes, my first contact was in 2012.
Okay. Your first contact, did he mention any time at any point during that contact about Angel Avila's involvement in this homicide?
None whatsoever.
Fair to say that there's been numerous letters written by Mr. Santos to the state attorney's office and the court over those years.
Yes,
Prior to January 2016, did any of those letters, correspondence, or anything along the lines or interviews with Mr. Santos, did he mention Angel Avila being involved?
no,
Okay. Prior to that, was there a court proceeding in which Mr. Avila's name was mentioned?
there was.
When was that?
Court hearing was June 17th, 2015.
Okay. So that would have predated that by almost 18 months, his letter that first named Angel Avila.
No, by almost 6-7 months.
I'm sorry, 7 months, my bad. I can't add very well, so I'm a lawyer. Was that hearing covered by the media?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Was Mr. Avila's name in that, was Mr. Avila's name mentioned in that media coverage?
Yes, it was.
Following that, did you interview Mr. Santos about Mr. Avila?
The following day,
Okay. Where was that located at?
Leon County Jail.
And as I understand it, defense counsel, yourself, and investigator Lewis were present during that interview.
That's correct.
Okay. Did he say anything in that interview about Mr. Avila?
He had never heard of him and did not know who he was.
Okay. And did anybody show him a picture?
Yes, the defense counsel showed him one.
And did he recognize the person in that picture?
No, he did not.
So as I understand it, it wasn't until after the hearing and after your interview in which y'all discussed Mr. Avila that he first made the claim about Mr. Avila, correct?
Correct.
How was it how was it he made the claim first regarding Mr. Avila?
We were provided a sworn statement by the defense from Mr. Santos,
Okay. And that was when?
January of 2016,
Okay. And that was a typed statement or a written statement?
typed.
Okay. Is that different than all the other correspondence that was given by Mr. Santos to both the court and
It's the
state?
only typed statement we've ever received from Santos.
Okay. Following that mention, did you locate Mr. Avila?
I did.
And where was he located at?
Trieste or Trieste, Italy. I don't know how to say the name.
Okay. And you talked to Mr. Avila?
Through a translator, I did, yes,
Okay. Why through a translator?
because he doesn't speak English at all.
Okay. At some point, did Mr. Santos make a claim about Demario Paramore involved in this homicide?
He did, late 2017.
Okay. And was that, how was that mention made?
I was following another court proceeding where Mr. Paramore's name was mentioned.
Okay. And was that in a letter or a typed statement?
It was in a letter to the court, actually.
Okay. And when was that letter dated?
August 17th, 2017.
Okay. Prior to that August 17th, 2017, was there a court proceeding in which Mr. Paramore's name was mentioned?
Yes, there was.
When was that court proceeding?
It is a week or two prior to the letter being written. It was early August of 17.
Okay. And was that hearing covered by the media?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And was Mr. Paramore's named in the mention of that media coverage?
Yes,
So we've been following that media coverage that he mentioned Paramore for the first time.
correct.
So both Angel Avila and Mr. Paramore, both of them mentioned by Mr. Santos, but both of those were first brought to the attention after court proceedings and/or interviews in which there was those names were brought to him.
Correct.
Prior to that August 17, 2017 correspondence, had he made any claims about Demario Paramore at that point?
No,
And any of the correspondence that you received or interviews?
no.
Did you go and speak with Mr. Santos to inquire whether or not he spoke Spanish?
I did
When was that?
last week.
Okay. How'd you go about figuring that out?
We have an intern in our office that's Venezuelan and speaks Spanish. Took her out there, and I didn't say a word. Let her communicate with him in Spanish, and he did not understand a single thing that was said to him.
No further questions.
Well,
I just want to clarify a couple of things. Angel Avila's full name is Angel Avila, or Quinones Avila Quinones. One of those.
Angel Antonio Avila Quinones.
Right, and so when, I guess it was 2015, when, I'm sorry?
I couldn't hear you.
I guess it was 2015 when you and prior counsel, Mark Lewis, and the investigator for the defense at that time went out and interviewed him. He did say he knew Quinones, who was a drug trafficker who funneled his drugs through Atlanta, right?
He said he knew a Quinones that was a drug trafficker, yes.
And talked about him going through Atlanta?
Yeah, it's Atlanta to Texas or something.
Okay, thank you, no further questions.
redirect.
And that interview occurred after the hearing and the media coverage, correct?
It was the following day, yes.
And Mr. Avila's full name was disclosed in the media coverage or not?
I don't recall the full name. I do know Antonio Avila Quinones has been said several times, yes.
Okay, so not the full thing, but you know the Quinones Avila name was published in that media coverage the day before?
Correct.
Okay. No further question.
Did you ever have a question of this witness? Step there. Next witness?
Yes, sir.
You face the clerk of this one, please.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. Let's see, sign it back to the list.
Morning, sir.
Good morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jurors?
Yes, my name is Patrick Sanford. I'm the special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Okay. And how long have you been with the FBI?
Approximately 20 years, a little over 20 years.
And do you have any other prior law enforcement experience?
Yes, I was a police officer in Montgomery, Alabama for approximately 5 years prior to that.
Not going to get into all your duties at the FBI because I'm sure some of it we may not be able to know, but at some point did you become involved in assisting the state attorney's office regarding the homicide or state of Florida versus Henry Segura?
Yes, I did.
And was that involvement to help locate an Angel Avila?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And did you locate an Angel Avila?
Yes, I did.
Where was he?
He was in, living in Trieste, Italy.
Okay. At some point did you travel to Italy to get Mr. Avila's DNA?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Did you have to go to his home to do that?
No, I went to Rome, Italy, to where our United States Embassy is at, and he met me in Rome.
So he traveled from Trieste, Italy to Rome to meet with you?
Yes, he did.
So this wasn't a situation where you had to compel him or do a search warrant or something along those lines for it?
No, not at all.
He willingly provided that DNA sample?
Yes, he was very cooperative.
At some point, did you have to travel back to Italy?
Yes, I did.
Did you travel, when was that?
The first trip was in 2016, September, when I collected his DNA and fingerprints. And this time I just went back on, it was last week. I met with him on November the 8th.
Okay. And that was to assist in providing closed circuit testimony?
That's correct.
Okay. Did you meet with Avila then?
I did.
Okay. How tall is Mr. Avila?
He's a little bit shorter than me, probably 5'7", 5'8", somewhere around there.
Okay. How tall are you?
5'9", 5'10".
All right. So he's I'm sorry, how tall did you say he was?
He was about 5'7", 5'8", at least an inch or two shorter than me.
What kind of build is he?
Average build, slightly on the little bit skinny side, but just normal build.
Would you classify him as a tall, skinny Colombian?
No, not at all.
This closed circuit testimony was in contact and communication you had with Mr. Vila. Did you have to use a translator to do so?
Yes, we did.
No further questions.
Rob? No problem. Step in.
Your Honor, this might be a good time to take a 10-minute or a morning break.
We're gonna do
Play
it.
video.
Good.
Yes, sir.
All right, we'll let you take 10 minutes. I see those, mention of, Menard, and there was another page I had it, which had the state's, cross on it. Well, it's all very brief. We all discussed how you want to do that.
No, Your Honor, we had talked about doing that during lunch hour. This video should take us to the lunch hour, and we talked about trying to figure out how we can do that at lunch hour.
Okay, all right. Say if the video becomes too difficult just for that small segment, then do it the old-fashioned way. Just have you pick somebody to relate what was said. But we used to always do it, but now very seldom do it. But anyway, so, all right. We'll take 10 minutes.
Thank you, Your Honor.